I come from a place in Malta which is known as the Ireland of Malta. We are called the Irish of Malta. So also something that we say in my town is that we are Maltese by birth and Irish by the grace of God.
That was Ambassador Giovanni Buttigieg from the Island of Malta and the Ireland of Malta. And I'm John Lee.
And I'm Martin Nutty. Welcome to another episode of Irish Stew, the podcast for the global Irish nation.
This episode of Irish Stew is sponsored by the Irish Heritage Tree Program. Celebrate your Irish roots by planting native trees for family and friends in the beautiful Golden Vale of Ireland. Go to irishheritagetree.com and use the exclusive discount code today. It's IrishStew10 for 10% off. That code again is IrishStew and the numeral 10. Keep the heritage of Ireland green and growing by going to irishheritagetree.com.
Hi, everybody. This is Martin Nutty, and you are listening to the Irish Stew podcast. And I'm joined in our studio by John Lee. John, how the hell are you?
Doing fine here, Martin. Really looking forward to taking a bit of a trip here for our listeners on Irish Stew, because today we add a new international ingredient to Irish Stew, and it comes from the island nation of Malta. Strategically located, and perhaps sometimes too strategically located, in the center of the Mediterranean, south of Sicily, west of Tunisia, north of Libya. An island nation that, despite its differences in culture, climate, cuisine, shares considerable common ground with the island of Ireland. We are honored to introduce you all today to Malta's ambassador to Ireland, His Excellency Giovanni Buttigieg. Welcome, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Nice to see you again.
Let me kick it off. So I mentioned that we met a few years ago in New York and at an Irish consulate event. And I only caught your first name, so I assumed you were Italian, but you explained you were Maltese. But you really did seem to have an affinity for Ireland.
I come from a place in Malta which is known as the Ireland of Malta. We are called the Irish of Malta. So also something that we say in my town is that we are Maltese by birth and Irish by the grace of God.
And what's the origin of that? Why would that part of, are we talking about Floriana here?
Exactly.
And what is the origin, or what's the reason why people in that area of Malta, which I understand is just outside the capital city of Valletta, it's on the periphery, why would Maltese in that district refer to themselves as the Irish of Malta?
Yes, you are right. It is in the periphery of Valletta. It's just outside of Valletta, of the capital. There are two theories on why we are known as the Irish or the Irish of Malta. The most dominant one is related to football or to soccer. As we were part of the British Empire at the time, some Irish regiments had their barracks in Floriana, in my town, and this was the time when football started, and it was exported around the world to a great extent by the British Army, by the British forces. And since the Irish Fusiliers were in Floriana, they taught my ancestors, who were the young men at the time, how to play the game. They had their colors, which were green and red at the time, but when after this memorable match with the Irish Fusiliers, after having trained them enough and taught them how to play, they exchanged gears and they kept the white and green color since then. We still play in green and white.
And the team is that they call it the Tal Irish?
Yeah, Tal means of Ireland or of the Irish. Yes. Even the chant that you hear most in the ground when there is a match starts with the line, "The Irish are made of steel." Now, of course, they are not referring to the Irish of the island of Ireland, but to the Irish means Floriana. The Irish are made of steel. Another story is related to an Irish cardinal who, on his way to Rome, somehow found a way of passing by Malta. And the Floriana Band Club organized a big since the harbor, since he had to come up from the harbor from Floriana, they organized a big feast for him. Cardinal, a big man of the church. Malta, especially at that time, was very, very Catholic, like Ireland. And this cardinal enjoyed it a lot. And on the way back, they organized it again when he was leaving Malta. When he left, then he went to the Holy See, to the Vatican for his regular visit. He worked hard to obtain for the Floriana parish certain privileges, and so also this is another historical association between Malta and Floriana, which predates the football. The football club will be 130 years next year, which makes it one of the oldest in the world.
Who won that first game?
I don't know, but I can speculate. I'm sure Floriana were the better team, but I don't know if they were.
I understand that it's a non-obvious relationship between Malta and Ireland because to some degree, both countries are on the extremities of Europe. So I understand that it's likely that the Irish started first showing up in Malta following Britain taking control of Malta, I believe, in 1813 after the Napoleonic Wars. And then the theory that I read about the cardinal that visited Malta, I think his name was Michael Logue, was that he had gone to Malta to meet with the Irish troops that were stationed there. But it seems like the Irish have been in Malta for probably close to 200 years now. And obviously the good cardinal enjoyed his visit to Malta. But I think Irish people visit Malta quite regularly now. Am I correct in that?
Yes, it's a let's say it's a favorite destination. The flights to Malta from Ireland, normally they are over 94% to capacity, month on month. We have flights from Dublin as well as from Shannon. So yes, I mean, Irish people are coming to Malta at the moment. The only limitation is capacity, carrying capacity. Probably after the coming to Malta with the British troops, yes, some 200 years ago. The big influx of Irish people in Malta came in the World Cup of 1990, which was hosted in Italy, which is our neighbor to the north. The Irish games, the group in which Ireland was playing, was located to Sicily. They played in Sicily. And Malta marketed itself as a good place for the Irish people to stay during that football month, and it worked very well. So for 1 month, Malta was turned green. Everywhere you look were Irish supporters, Irish fans, and they would party all day. And then, let's say 1 or 2 hours before the match, they would be shipped to the airport, loaded on a plane, already in spirit.
Diplomatically said.
Yes, get to Sicily, where alcohol was prohibited at the time during matches in cities where there were the matches. Alcohol could not be bought for certain hours. So the Irish would watch the match and rush back to the plane where they could again start drinking and return to Malta as happy as they left, irrespective of the results. But one has to say that Irish did really well. Did really well in that match, and as far as I can recall, it is the competition in which they advanced the most in the history of Irish football. I think they got to the quarterfinals or something.
I saw a tourism article in Irish Central written by Cahir O'Doherty, who just loved going to Malta. He loved every bit of it. He describes how there's no shortage of Irish bars and Irish expats, Irish barmen and Irish women. He was a little surprised to see them all tanned, which is not the usual look for an Irish bartender. But he said there were dozens of Irish bars on the island.
Yes, there are quite a lot of Irish bars all over the island. The expat community is growing. I have to say, even the Maltese community in Ireland is growing. There are a number of people who come to Ireland from Malta for an internship or for a stage. I don't know, they are studying, for example, catering or in the hotel industry. They come here for 6 months or 1 year. They go back, and most of them will return and make Ireland their home. So the Maltese population of Ireland grew a lot in the last years. Let's say from a stable 200 to 150 people, and I think now unofficially I think it stands at around 800. And it happened very fast. So it's not huge, but the growth is huge.
We talked about sort of, I opened up with talking about the comparisons and the common ground between Ireland and Malta. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about just your growing up in Malta, what the community life was like, and then we'll touch on some of the high points of your career before your ultimate high point of being the ambassador to Ireland.
Well, I grew up in an environment which probably is very familiar to many Irish people of perhaps a bit of an older generation. I grew up in a family of 11 kids. So my mother and father were very much dedicated to the family. And it was very nice, growing up with so many people at home. You were never short of company. You were never short of people to tease or people to tease you, and always finding someone to play with. It was. I grew up in a time also where Malta probably started moving from the post-war or directly post-war generation, people who had it good, people who started to have relatively good jobs, where more and more women were finding space, this made society much richer, much better. There was also an element of liberation. In the beginning, we start to see in Malta the transformation in our legal system of certain rules that perhaps were not compatible to a modern state in terms of, for example, sexual orientation and so on. So it was this time of change where the church exercised, or rather than exercised, enjoyed a lot of power, and there is good reason for it. The church has been very benevolent in Malta. It started, orphanages, and it looked after the most destitute and the homeless, and the church started the first proper care for people with drug addiction and other addictions. And so, yes, there was good reason also for the church to have this hold, to have this respect, to enjoy this respect. Around 1/3 of kids in Malta attend church school. That's so it's also strong influence. And then also during my childhood, most kids would attend in the evening after school to some kind of church organization. So this goes to say, it was a very religious environment. Many things went around religion, but it was also a time of starting to fatten from that, of starting to move away from it. What else? It was also it was a time of growth in politics. It was probably our adolescence as an independent state. We got our independence in 1964, which means in my teens, the country was a very young independent state, and it passed through the normal stage of, perhaps certain institutions being challenged, certain views of democracy being experimented with. But I have to say that our leaders, our politicians, with the support of the population, managed to come out of it in a mature way, and we left that behind and we moved forward. And today we are very proud of our very solid democratic.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to touch on one religious note there. I think I mentioned I've actually been to Malta. I was in my back career as a travel writer. I was on a cruise ship, and I spent a day in Malta. So not a lot of time, but I got a flavor for it. The beautiful, the architecture, the kind of colors as you come into the harbor there, just incredible. And one thing I certainly remember is going to the church that I remember being referred to as the Church of the Knights of Malta. And that's one kind of association internationally that people have with Malta. What is that? And where does that come from? And what are the Knights of Malta?
The Knights of Malta know their origin more or less 1,000 years ago. They were not known as the Knights of Malta at the time. It was, let's say, a military, religious, hospitalier order. And its members came from aristocracy. To become a knight, you had to prove 4 generations of uninterrupted nobility. And their original intention was to defend pilgrims going to the Holy Land, visiting Bethlehem and Jerusalem, and the sites associated with the origins of Christianity. Of course, when there was movement, there was trade. When there was trade, there was money to be made. When there was money to be made, there was money to be stolen. And so it was a dangerous route. And there were these orders that were formed to protect pilgrims. From protection of pilgrims, then they also started to take over the area. Eventually, this particular order was expelled from there. It was in Rhodes for some time, and then they ended up without territory, without land. Most of them returned many of them returned to their aristocratic families in Europe. But the King of Spain was asked by the Pope at the time to give the Knights some territory, some area, some land from the vast Spanish kingdom. The King of Spain decided to give Malta on the desire, on the wish or the request of the Pope. Again, Spain was also a very Catholic country. They gave this territory, which in fact was Malta and Tripolitania, Malta and 1/3 of Libya, more or less. This was one territory. Of course, this part, which was not part of the island, was then under the hands of other rulers. So effectively, although it was given to the Knights, it was never ruled by the Knights. The Knights had Malta. The Knights stayed in Malta for a number of centuries, and this is how they got the name, the Knights of Malta. But they didn't originate in Malta. I don't think there are records of any Maltese knights at the time. But still they are known as the Knights of Malta. They were eventually expelled from Malta by Napoleon Bonaparte on his way to Egypt in 1789. In 1789, on his way to Egypt, 1798. 1789 was the French Revolution. 1798, on his way to Egypt, he passed by Malta, he took Malta. The Knights left Malta. Most of them moved to Russia. They were given They were given protection by the Czar at the moment. Some moved to Sicily. And eventually, the group that went to Sicily got this recognition by the Holy See, by the Vatican. And the current Order of Knights of Malta, its full name is the Sovereign Hospitalier Order of the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem, Rhodes, and Malta. So Malta is a small part of the name. And yes, so the current Order of the Knights is descending from this, from this order, from the same order. So that's the link of the Knights with Malta.
Very good.
If I think about, the history of Malta is extraordinary, simply because of its duration. As I understand, the island was probably inhabited about 7,000 years ago. But what struck me as you were speaking about the Knights was this intersection between the Arab world, if you will, and Malta itself, and the role that Malta played in that contest over control of the Mediterranean, which, as I understand, culminated with the Siege of Malta in 1565. But I also note in your career that you had some involvement, I think, with the Organization of Arab States, if I'm correct. And the language spoken in Malta, I believe, is actually derived from Arabic, because, as I understand, the Malta, I believe, in the 9th century was actually controlled by Arabs. So I'm kind of curious, does the language, does the history, etc., kind of position Malta, diplomatically, if you will, to be an important interface with the world, the Arab world itself? Or is there a kind of bitterness even now, almost 500 years later after the Siege of Malta? So kind of curious about how that sets up and what your experience was with interfacing with the world of Arab diplomacy.
So going back to the historical side of it, yes, Malta spent centuries also under Arab rule. This influenced the language a lot. There are various theories on the origins of the Maltese population, and it is possible that Malta was populated, then was depopulated, and then repopulated. But definitely, with centuries of Arab rule, the language picked up a lot of Arabic. It is certainly a Semitic language, even if we use the Latin alphabet. It's a Semitic language with strong influence of everyone basically who ruled Malta. So we also import Italian and other Romance vocabulary. The English language had its influence of the language, but let's say grammatically and the structure is a Semitic language. It's very similar to Hebrew, to Arabic, to Swahili. It's the same family of languages.
Could we hear you speak in Maltese a little bit?
Ija, nista' nkellmek bil-Malti. Ma naħsibx li tifhem ħafna. Min jifhem l-Arbi probably jifhimni. So I was saying I can't speak, but you might not understand much, but people who know Arabic can pick up quite a lot of it.
Yeah.
My in-laws are from Baghdad, and their primary language is Arabic. And so when you started speaking Maltese, I recognized some of those inflections. They sounded particularly Arabic to me, with kind of a shade of Italian to it. It's an interesting combination. Obviously, I had no idea what you were saying.
I think it was the hand gestures. I was picking up the Italian.
I understand the listeners cannot see those. then politically, we were under the Arabs, and of course, every ruler rules for his benefit normally, not for the benefit of those being ruled. And like other rulers, obviously, they use the island for their exploits. I wouldn't say there is any remnants of any hatred or contempt to that period is too far. And I have to say that we don't have that with any other nation that ruled us. We have extremely good relationship with Britain, which was our last ruler. We have a very good relationship with France in the European Union, who were the rulers before the British. We keep a very nice, healthy, and good relationship with the Order of St. John, or the Order of Malta, that ruled Malta before that. And similarly, we have good relations with the Arabs, we have good relations with the Spanish. Everyone basically ruled Malta. We don't have issues with, at least at this modern age.
It sounds a little bit like Ireland, Mr. Ambassador, in that sort of potentially honest broker role you can play diplomatically, like Ireland. Malta has never conquered anybody and left a bad taste in anyone's mouth through colonialism. We want to get you over to Ireland, but let's. This might be a good time to talk about your time at the UN and in New York and your role there. What were some of your experiences and impressions of the UN and of New York?
I always consider it a great privilege to work in New York, at least to spend some time in New York, other than as a tourist. It's a great city. It's a city that really has everything. So I look at that time with a lot of gratitude, the time I spent in New York. Dealing with the United Nations is extremely gratifying. It's nice. One gets to understand as well why certain things work and so why certain things cannot work. Yes, more can be done, and this is something you realize there. In a way, it can turn you very cynical dealing with the United Nations about international affairs. On the other hand, you realize what a force for good the United Nations is, and how much better we are with a weak United Nations than without a United Nations, because the alternative we have to a not so strong United Nations is not a strong United Nations, but no United Nations. So it's the alternative we have is the best at the moment. Of course, one hopes that the rule of law, international rule of law, gains more and more traction. And that can happen also thanks to the United Nations. So I have very good memories there. And then also I was there as the Deputy Permanent Representative of Malta to the United Nations. And I have to say that from everything I have done, there is nothing which gives you more satisfaction than representing your people, So my experience in New York seems to have, hit all the beautiful things in life. But then I was also lucky that I met my wife there. Today is my wife. The girl that today is my wife. So I think that experience was very generous with me. Those 4.5 years I spent there.
Your time in New York, well, you would have had a difficulty, I think, in New York, but things changed for you in that a few years ago, nobody would have been able to pronounce your last name. And thanks to the current Secretary of the Transportation Department here in the U.S., Pete Buttigieg, we now know how to navigate that name. Do people, immediately relate to Pete? They ask you if you're related. Are you related?
Yeah, so starting from the first part, it's true. When I arrived in New York, people found pronouncing my name much easier than my surname. But by the end of it, people preferred or were more familiar with my surname Buttigieg than my first name Giovanni. And that's, of course, not is thanks to the ascendance of Pete Buttigieg and his political career there. In fact, Pete Buttigieg spent a lot of time in Malta. He can speak Maltese. and his father is from the same town of my father. And there is another Buttigieg family. So there are at least 3 Buttigieg families in Hamrun. And they all come from the sister island. So Malta has a mainland, which is called Malta, and then smaller island goes on. And these Buttigieg families come from the sister island. They came to Malta in search of work, in search of employment. Hamrun, the town where these families settled, is close to the harbor. It was at the time the closest residential area to the harbor. Today there are other towns in between. Yes, and for those who are curious, Bu in Semitic languages denotes authority, power. Abu, Abba is father, Abu. In fact, you have a lot of Arab leaders who adopt that name, like I know Abu Abbas, Abu Jihad, Abu Nidal. This is not necessarily the name they grew up with, but they took it as they became leaders. So Abu means chief or owner, or Tijich nevertheless means chicken. So it's not a big chief, it's a chief of chicken, but still a chief, I would say. And probably it comes from families who grew chickens or who tended poultry, that's probably the origin.
So can I ask what the impact of Pete Buttigieg's candidacy or rise, if you will, into politics, how did that play out in Malta? What kind of impacts did that make? Because I think for many Americans, their knowledge of Malta would have been quite limited. It is, as you pointed out, a relatively small country, very highly, densely populated. There's only 500,000 people, as I understand it, live on the islands themselves. So I'm curious, was there any kind of direct impact? Did more people kind of start visiting, or more people started asking more questions about the country itself as a result of that?
And I do think that in the US, yes, it raised more interest in the country. There are several towns in the US, especially in rural US, called Malta, and it comes but from the production of malt or of whiskey or of alcohol, which used malt. But now Malta as a nation, all of a sudden, yes, the interest in Malta grew with the rise of Pete Buttigieg. In Malta, naturally, there was quite a nice sense of pride, by the fact that someone managed to get so far, in US politics. It's very difficult to establish also a direct link. One has to keep in mind also that in 2000 we had COVID, everything that was progressing came to a halt. So if numbers were going up, everything went down again.
Yep.
And it's like now we talk of the pre and post-COVID in any figures we mention, we say, how does it compare with 2019? It's like, there was the pre and the post-COVID. That's the standard. So I would say it's difficult to measure exactly, but certainly, yes, it did create some ripples.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Ambassador, let's get you over to Ireland now, because I was really happy when I heard that was your next post, because I knew how the affinity you had for Ireland. You mentioned a way you prepared for your new post and prepared for getting to know Ireland.
Yes, I tried. First of all, Irish literature is quite well known, well spread. Even if not everyone would know that it's Irish. People might think it is coming from another country. Some people think that it's American or Brit or from the UK. A lot of plays, Irish plays and Irish writers, like Ireland, does not always get the credit for what produced, even if it had in recent years 3 Nobel laureates in literature. Ireland. So one thing I apart from revising my Irish literature, I decided on a personal challenge when I came here. There is one art form that I still struggle with it, but I used to struggle with more is poetry. It's probably the art form that I find it very difficult to get stimulated by. And so I combined my posting in Ireland with reading a poem every day from an Irish poem every day. And I started with a collection by Seamus Heaney, 100 poems collected in collaboration with his children and so on. And of course, I had actually to discipline myself to read only one of this poem every day. And my treat was on days when the day before I could not read the poem, and then I say, listen, today I deserve to read two because I missed yesterday. So, of course, that my 100 days in Ireland were marked by finishing this book.
Do you have a favorite poem or a passage of one you could share with us?
Well, there are several that I like. And since you told me before the program, I decided to prepare one, scaffolding. Scaffolding. Construction industry is very important where I come from. Housing is a big issue. Construction is a big issue in Ireland. But also it coincided with proposing to my wife this. So I thought I will share it dedicated to her, and I will read it for you if you. Naturally, you have to be prepared to my accent, I don't think many people would have heard it in an Italianized pronunciation, but I'll do my best. Scaffolding by Seamus Heaney. Masons, when they start up on a building, are careful to test out the scaffolding. Make sure that planks won't slip at busy points. Secure roll ladders, tighten bolted joints. And yet, all this comes down when the job's done, showing off walls of sure and solid stone. So if, my dear, there sometimes seem to be old bridges breaking between you and me, never fear. We may let the scaffolds fall, confident that we have built our wall.
Beautiful. Lovely.
And I do like the Italianate version of it, I will say. It introduces, to my way of looking at things, a bit of a romanticized view of it. And I was curious, your name is obviously Giovanni, which is the Italian for John, as I understand it. And I would, because of my limited knowledge of Malta, would have just assumed, listening to you speak, that you were actually Italian. I'm assuming that is something that you experience periodically and you have to explain. Is the Maltese accent, is it generally mistaken as Italian by many people?
Let's say I think probably is the most Italianized of English accents. Compared to South Africa, Australia, Canada, it would be the most Italianized. I'm not sure that mine represents that kind of Italianization. I think in my case, it's more enhanced. I don't know why. I didn't actually live in Italy, but yes, people mistaken for Italian. I was once on a mission in Kenya, and I was asking questions to people as part of my job. I was there as an international electoral observer in Mombasa, an area popular with Italian tourists. But I would ask questions to Kenyan officials, and they would reply to me in Italian, thinking that I am an Italian struggling to speak English as a sign of respect. Yeah. So yeah, I know. That's yeah.
I'm sure they didn't mistake you for an Italian when you arrived to present your credentials to the President of Ireland as the ambassador. Could you describe how that felt and that experience for you?
It's a very nice experience presenting credentials. Even with my discussions with my colleagues, with my other ambassadors, they say that the presentation of credentials ceremony in Ireland is one of the nicest they have experienced in their career. It includes inspection of the guard when you hear your national anthem played, by the military. Meeting President Higgins. He's a very, very special person who is also a poet, by the way. Mm-hmm. It's very nice to have this tete-a-tete with the president that you don't get often. You get it in special occasions like that. It's very moving. It's very moving. The Irish state makes a big event out of the presentation of credentials. It's very nice. And now, since I've been here for a year, of course, I discussed it with newcomers. When ambassadors take their post, they visit ambassadors who are already on the ground in the same city. They courtesy visits, and no matter how much you prepare them that it is a nice ceremony, they come back and tell you, listen, I didn't expect it to be so nice. So it is indeed a very nice ceremony. And on this point also, I would like to say that in the year that I have been here, I also accompanied President Higgins to Malta. It was also a very nice occasion to get the President of Ireland to Malta. We also have had a visit to Ireland by the Speaker of Parliament as a guest of the Concorle, of the Speaker, if you want, of the leader of the Irish Parliament. And we are preparing return visits. The Concorle should be in Malta also in the near future, and hopefully also.
So, Ambassador, can I ask, I would assume that any diplomatic mission to a country has a particular set of priorities within that country. So if you were to kind of list out the major priorities, the top three, if you will, of Maltese priorities in Ireland, what would those goals be?
Well, I have to say that we share, now if we move to the political sphere, we share a lot with Ireland. We are a neutral country. We're not in any military alliance. As mentioned earlier by John, the fact that we are small, people trust when we try to mediate that we don't have territorial or ambitions or other ambitions, and we are too small to govern much beyond our territory. So we are like Ireland. For us, international rule of law is very important, because since we cannot aspire to have huge armies, we cannot aspire to be protected by nuclear weapons. Our strongest defense is the international rule of law. If something happens to us, we can fight it with legal arguments and using the legal instruments in our disposal. Being two countries in the periphery of Europe, between Europe and another continent, the US or the Americas in the case of Ireland, and Africa in the case of Malta. Having a strong history of emigration, our people are everywhere, probably less visible than the Irish, also because of numbers. But huge parts of our population had to leave, in the past. And recently experiencing a net return, or let's say a net immigration rather than emigration. Then also the fact that we try, the The way we try to develop our economies is also very, very similar. We try to attract investment by being creative and offer possibly, like fiscal incentives for the companies to set up shop in our country. That makes us very, very similar, very close or very aligned, Therefore, we are not here to try to fix issues with Ireland. Thank God. Thank God. That's a very boring area. We don't have conflicts. We don't have any disagreements. Being part of the European Union, both countries where a lot of our politics now takes place, a lot of things that will shape the day-to-day life of people are formulated. It is very important to us, since we are such strong allies and we are so aligned on so many issues, even the European Union. It is important to keep as many channels as possible open between the two countries, to make sure that this alignment stays and we support each other as much as possible. So this is the first purpose of my mission here, is to keep the political channels as open and as rich as possible. Second is trade, trying to increase trade between the two countries, also trade for the two countries. We import. Malta imports significant amounts of dairy from Ireland, dairy products. There is also a lot of trade. There is also a lot of trade in pharmaceuticals and medicine between the two countries. And Malta is also probably the recent biggest investment from Ireland has been in airline, the airline industry. So trade is important. Of course, we are both small countries. When you look at the big picture, the economy of both Malta and Ireland is small, of course, of Malta much smaller. But it is important, trade. And then also, we consider Ireland not only a producer of culture, but also a strong consumer of culture. So we think it's a good market for us to export our cultural produce,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure we are both familiar with Ireland, and you see theaters full. If you go to a book launch, you see they are full. People buy the books. You see lines, people for the theater. So I think it's also because we have this medium of English. It could be for us. It's a very important. It could develop into a very important market. So I would say those would be my three main priorities. Yeah.
Well, let's take you for a moment outside of the ambassador role and just more of someone new to living in Ireland. I saw a comparison between the Irish and the Maltese climate, where both climates were rated on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being the worst and 100 being the best. Malta rated a 75, Ireland rated a 2. Do you agree with that?
I think Irish weather receives a lot of unfair criticism. I found summer very mild here, very nice. Not too hot, not cold. I like, for example, the weather most of the time is very conducive for walking. People who like walks, because you are not going to get a sunstroke. At the same time, also, you're not going to freeze. And then, yes, it rains from time to time, but then it's not that, that in 1 hour it's going, to stop. I understand that some people might not like this weather, but I think in general it's agréable in French. It's nice. I really like it. And one thing that I enjoy a lot is, even when maybe it's not hot or maybe it's raining, it's very rare that you don't see the sun, at least for one part of the day. Probably something that people might confuse with the weather, which may be a bit, let's say, a bit depressive, is the short days in the winter. This is not a climatic phenomenon, but I think the fact that the days are short, some people confuse that with Ireland having a grey weather. Yes, that might be not very nice, but it also is very short. I mean, we are still in the beginning of February, and already the days are quite much longer than they were a month ago. I like the Irish weather in general, I would say.
And when you're on these walks, what are you seeing? What are you experiencing? What are you enjoying about your time in Dublin?
I live a bit in the south of the city, so I get an opportunity to walk a lot in the countryside, and I like these hills. I like these vast areas where you don't see any building, any human intervention. I like this green, it's a very again gratifying result for the rain. The green is the result of the amount of rain that the country enjoys. So most of the time, this is what I enjoy. I also like the coast of Dublin, or the area around Dublin. I like to go for walks also there. And most of the time, it makes me think and wonder how, when you read or watch plays by Samuel Beckett, for example, you realize that probably the big influence of this environment on on the way they wrote or on the way they expressed themselves. And this is a subject. This is a subject of. I find myself thinking of a lot of time the relationship between the countryside and Irish literature, the influence of the countryside on Irish literature.
A similarity between the two countries are these kind of ancient megalithic temples. They're in Malta, and they're in Ireland, particularly at Newgrange. Is that a place you've ever have been to, or is on your bucket list to go to?
I haven't been there yet, but yes, I would like to visit them. I hope to visit them in spring.
Well, I hope you have a great spring. I know it's a beautiful time in Ireland, and I hope to get back to Malta, particularly after reading a couple of travel articles. I was there so briefly, but it has such a distinctive, unusual feeling to it, to an outsider. That blend of cultures is right there, kind of like written on the walls, written on the architecture. We're moving to the point of the program where we bring out shameless plug, Mr. Ambassador. We give you a chance to promote something near and dear to your heart. What would you like to tell our listeners to do, or you want them to know?
I would encourage them to invest in Malta. Malta is very open for business. There's a huge foreign investment landscape is very active. It offers a lot of incentives, and let's talk and do business.
If somebody did want to talk and do business, where would they go? How would they do it?
Well, if anyone gets in touch with the Embassy of Malta anywhere, that certainly these people will be led. But one website people should visit is that of Malta Enterprise.
We'll include that in our show notes, and we'll put that out in a few different ways. I want to give you one little piece of trivia before we end up, a trivia that connects your hometown to Irish stew in a different way. I just happened to see that Floriana is a sister city to Macerata, Italy, and that's the home of one of our Irish stew guests in the past, John McCourt, who is the head of the university there. So just a little odd connection between Floriana and Irish stew. Mr. Ambassador, thank you so very much. We really appreciate the time. We look forward to seeing you in Ireland and perhaps in Malta too.
Thank you very much.
Hey, that was a great new dimension to our global Irish conversation. You know, such a different country Malta is from Ireland, and yet so many similarities. And to find this kind of affinity Irish outpost of Ireland in the middle of the Mediterranean, really interesting stuff. And I'll just say parenthetically, I've had a brief visit to Malta, and I really recommend it highly. It's a very, very beautiful and unusual place. And I would love to have seen the time around the World Cup when Malta welcomed all the Irish tourists and turned the island green. And that's a tradition in Maltese football, isn't it?
Well, it's kind of interesting because the town that Giovanni grew up in, of course, is Floriana, and their soccer team is referred to as the Irish. And that dates back to the days when there were Irish troops actually serving in the British Army in Malta and had a soccer team. And they played together. And the Floriana team adopted the Irish colours thereafter. And it became the Ireland of Malta. How about that for soccer diplomacy?
You know, I was so happy I met Giovanni when he was over here attached to the UN for Malta. And then when I heard he was the Irish ambassador, I was thrilled. Let's close off with what he said at one point in the conversation. Maltese by birth, Irish by the grace of God.
Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.